I'm guessing most of you know the basic drill about the Gonzaga Socratic Club. We were founded over a decade ago, and we generally meet once a month during this academic year. And we take our inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club that was presided over by C.S. Lewis in the mid-1900s. Especially the idea of the Socratic Club in Oxford was follow the argument wherever it leads, especially regarding discussion, philosophical discussion of Christianity. And so that's our focus and objective. And I want to say that of the figures that we occasionally bump into here in the Socratic Club, Kierkegaard is one of my favorites. We might say, I'm sure our speaker today will disabuse us of the technical infelicity of me saying this, but we might say that Kierkegaard is our contemporary in the fact that he has so affected modern intellectual culture. But we know that there is a specialized meaning of contemporaneity, which we're going to be talking about in just a moment. Our speaker is Clay Bohnet from the philosophy department here at Gonzaga University. And his talk is What is Living and What is Dead in Kierkegaard. I should have had it in front of me, but anyway, Contemporaneity with Christ and Kierkegaard. So welcome, Dr. Bohnet.
Thank you. I wanted to thank David for letting me present my research. This is very much a living research for me. This summer, I was trying to work on the introduction to this text I'm working on the history of Spinoza's reception. And it's a very peculiar problem, I think, to try to think the historical progression or not progression of the way in which a thinker has been taken up by his subsequent readers. And I had read Kierkegaard's Contemporaneity with Christ, or Practice in Christianity, a long time ago, and was very affected by this idea of what does it mean to live in contemporaneity with Christ, and for me as like a pseudo-Hegelian, what does it mean to live in contemporaneity with the absolute? And so to me, this is a paper that is trying to preface an attempt to read the history of Spinoza's reception. And I'm wondering if I can't start to think about Spinoza as this eternally contemporary figure that haunts us in our philosophical practice. That's my preamble. It's kind of jargony, right? It's a jargony paper. I'm trying to be consistent with my terms. But if at any point, like, you want to throw up your hands, like, I don't understand, you're using this term a lot, please ask the question, and I will be happy to field it on the fly, kind of quick, to move on, but just for clarification's sake, okay? And I wanted to also thank Ted for doing this, because he sat through multiple versions of this paper. Every morning I would send him a new version for him to survey. And he was politely curt in his responses. And so it was wonderful. And I also want to thank the Socrates Club, because it's nice to have about 30 minutes or 35 minutes to actually take one's time and try to provide a thorough exposition. It is much appreciated. All right, so this is the part one, clever and provocative intro, which is a facade. For Kierkegaard, to be Christian is to become contemporary with Christ. How can one become contemporary with someone who lived and died, for Kierkegaard, 1800 years ago? Since becoming Christian has to do with entering into a zone of contemporaneity with Christ, how should we understand the meaning of contemporary? How does the fact that Kierkegaard says that Christ's life has eternal contemporaneity help us answer this question? Let us start our journey towards what it turns out will only be a partial answer with an evaluation of the conventional meaning of the word contemporary and then transition into Kierkegaard's own, what I think is a dialectical exposition. So part 2, short. Part 1, very short. Part 2, the contemporary as the simultaneously actual. Your handout kind of has like the greatest hits of each section, which sometimes turns out to be just one statement. So you can kind of follow along. This quote starts part 2. I never provide an exegesis of this specific quote because I think the entire paper is an exegesis of this quote. Thus, every human being is able to become contemporary only with the time in which he is living, and then with one more, with Christ's life upon earth. For Christ's life upon earth, the sacred history, stands alone by itself outside of history. End quote. Kierkegaard's deployment of the concept of contemporaneity marks out a relation with something characterized as outside of history, alone, apart from the determinate actualities of what we'll see as our chatter. Kierkegaard wants to suggest that the halting presence of Christ speaks as much now as ever. And it is in our addressing this exceptional speaker that we begin upon the path of a genuine Christian practice. The function of this paper is to provide an overview of Kierkegaard's concept of this relation to what is in excess of actuality, history, and measurable durations of time. It aims to flesh out Kierkegaard's discussions of this uncanny contemporaneity, but does not seek to provide a philosophical account of how it is possible. And I hope that at the end, when we are all asking questions of our own, that you will take a moment to grill me on what would it take to provide a philosophical account of contemporaneity with the eternal. What is a contemporary? How can we situate Kierkegaard's notion of contemporaneity in relation to our contemporary usage of the term? The contemporary way of representing the contemporary is as an other who is actual at the same time as another actual existing entity or entities. Here I am in this moment, and my contemporary is working on research today on the history of the concept of gravity. We belong as actualities to the same present. My contemporary is there in actuality for me, whether 2 doors down the hall on the right or 2 continents to the east. The contemporary is a present actuality as much as I am, and I can traverse the actual to speak with her. It is obvious, is it not, that we today now are not contemporary with Benedictus Spinoza, given the 340 some odd years that separates this present actual moment from his death. The ordinary conception of the contemporary assumes the linearity of time, upon the crest of which ride a set of actualities existing in simultaneity. It assumes the sequence of events and beings within the order of prior and posterior, or before and after. And it assumes the reality of time as circumscribed within the measure of the actual. We can say then provisionally that in general, the contemporary is a situation of 2 actualities happening simultaneously at the cutting edge of the present. Now I'm going to skip this horrible analysis of the meaning of the contemporary as a noun and as an adjective. For time restraints, I mean, it's a nice, I gave you a little summary on the handout. The adjective, right, the contemporary historian, somebody who's contemporary with some other events, we can use it as an adjective to sort of categorize the noun. But what's really interesting is when we talk about contemporary art, like contemporary as an adjective for art, it means not just the art that's getting produced now. It means that art that is not just reproducing what's already been produced, something that's new or novel or at a certain cutting edge. So in 1906, Cubism was cutting edge. That would be contemporary art. But now somebody's doing Cubism and like we're saying, well, that's not contemporary. Contemporary might be installment art or this sort of thing. So I don't think it's essential to the argument. we just gave a brief summary of what it means to be contemporary in terms of the simultaneous actualities. So you and I are contemporary because we're both actual in this moment. And that seems to be the standard way of thinking the contemporary. This complex, overdetermined vernacular conception of the meaning of the word contemporary is what Kierkegaard in Philosophical Fragments refers to as contemporaneity in its immediacy. Both Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments of 1844 and Practice in Christianity, 1850, contain reflections on the nature of the contemporary. His reflections therein seek to liberate the concept of the contemporary from the regime of the actual, just as they seek to liberate the Christian from Christendom. In both cases, our contemporary and common conception of the meaning of the word contemporary is what Kierkegaard refers to as the immediate. The immediate contemporary of Christ would be someone who was simultaneously actual with Christ. But this immediate sense of being contemporary is for Kierkegaard something that is for the most part filled with chatter and essentially consists in the indefinite postponement of a genuine and singular encounter with the real. Yet, its import for Christianity is that contemporaneity in its immediacy can become a point of departure, a condition for an other contemporaneity, one that estranges us from any discourse whose function is to determine the relations of actualities. Quote, "The real contemporary is not that by virtue of immediate contemporaneity, but by virtue of something else. Thus, despite his being contemporary, a contemporary can be non-contemporary. The genuine contemporary is that not by virtue of immediate contemporaneity." End quote. Being immediately contemporary does not imply that one is contemporary with the real. For if it did, then Kierkegaard's claim that, quote, "someone who comes later must be able to be the genuine contemporary," this claim would make no sense. How is it possible for someone who comes after Christ to be contemporary with him? It's almost offensive to consider. Genuine contemporaneity, Kierkegaard says, is only thinkable in virtue of something else. There is something else in addition to immediate contemporaneity, something that exists outside of the linear sequence of actualities called history, and towards which, I think we can say with Kierkegaard, the subject, our religious consciousness with Hegel, is fundamentally oriented. Kierkegaard's concept of immediate contemporaneity as condition departs from our common vernacular. There's something essential to Christian practice that is in excess of conventional understanding. It is through our immediate actuality being taken as a condition whereby, in virtue of this mysterious something else, an other relation to contemporaneity, a different life becomes possible. Thus, the following, in seeking to give an account of the practice of Christianity, will give an account of this something else, of the movement of departure from the simultaneously actual towards the genuinely contemporary. All right, so it's all we've done is just we've defined contemporary in our common sense way, and we've shown that for Kierkegaard, this immediate contemporaneity is a point of departure, whereby a genuine contemporaneity can happen. So like, just because we're here and now doesn't mean we're contemporaries in the Kierkegaardian sense. In his Philosophical Fragments, Kierkegaard provides an account of immediate contemporaneity as a condition that unfolds in three moments. An unfolding reminiscent to me of certain characterizations of Hegel's dialectic. An uncannily similar threefold movement is found also in Practice in Christianity. In Fragments, the third moment is the believer, while in Practice, it is the one who is capable of receiving the blessing. The following provides an account of the movement beyond immediate contemporaneity in the Fragments for the sake of enriching our discussion of its parallel exposition in Practice. So when I'm just saying practice, I mean practice in Christianity. All right, number one. So we're going through the threefold process in Kierkegaard's Fragments. And the first stage is the eyewitness. So the first way immediate contemporaneity is conceived as a condition, is as the occasion for the individual to gain knowledge about an actuality. The contemporary in such a situation can be the occasion for one who is contemporary with him or her learning of something else that happened in the past or that is happening today. Essentially, the contemporary can provide us with an eyewitness account of a happening. We can gather facts about an actuality of import from the other. Kierkegaard's account is anchored to an interpretation of the value of historical knowledge of Christ's life for a Christian life. We can be told about the events of Christ's life as spectators via historical analysis of the different accounts in the Gospels. We can, Kierkegaard says, try to demonstrate through historical erudition the exceptionality of Christ's life. Oh yeah, Christ's life as such is a series of actualities that the spectator is directly informed about and can repeat to others as gospel. Yet, of course, as Kierkegaard affirms, the witness can only provide an account of an actuality, and this is the most important point, and cannot, quote, give the spectators opportunity to catch on to how it is done, what is done, how one practices Christianity. Something essential to the event of what is being talked about to the spectators cannot be inscribed within the discourse of the eyewitness or the historian. Immediate contemporaneity, this first form of the contemporary as condition, maintains a distance from the real. How it is done cannot be inscribed within an informational direct discourse about an actuality. The eyewitness and the scholar of history cannot inform us for all their veracity of how to do it, how to be Christian. The eyewitness is, as we will see, 2 steps removed from the real, 2 steps that, as it were, can only be traversed by a leap. Second moment, Socratic interiority. Second, immediate contemporaneity as condition can be the occasion for the individual to concentrate Socratically upon himself, whereby that, so this is quote, let me start again. Second, immediate contemporaneity as condition can be the occasion for the individual to, quote, concentrate Socratically upon himself, whereby that immediate contemporaneity vanishes as a nothing in comparison with the eternal he discovers within himself, end quote. The immediate contemporary is no longer the occasion for a spectator and a witness, but the vanishing condition for a turning inwards, an internal apprehension of the eternal idea. We turn from historical knowledge of Christ's life to an inner appropriation of that life. Thus, the immediate contemporaneity of simultaneous actualities becomes the condition for that inward turn that makes the simultaneously actual the vanishing inessential, and the eternal or interiority the essential. In so doing, it negates the actual in the name of the open question as to this singular life's, Christ's life, eternal significance. This negative flight to interiority is often associated by Kierkegaard with the possible because it is a seeking, an active wondering. The Socratic is a cultivated interiority that has negated the significance for faith of the eyewitness account, but which is not yet the fulfillment of what we can call the Word. The Socratic, the second moment, preserves the eyewitness account through negating it, and affirms the possible as an alterity to the actual. But as we will see, it fails to gather for all the work of its reflection how it is that one is to do it, how it is that one is to be a Christian. The idea cannot get us to the practice. Section 3, Sublation, the believer. Finally, the immediate contemporaneity can be the occasion for the moment of belief. Quote, yet a contemporary such as this, the believer, is not an eyewitness, but as a believer, she is a contemporary in the autopsy of faith. The autopsy of faith. Autopsy should be taken in its literal sense as, quote, the personal act of seeing. The believer is living this other contemporaneity in finding or seeing the eternal life. as the moment of contemporaneity with the absolute. Belief proper is the negation of the... Let me start that one again, because it's important. As the moment of contemporaneity with the absolute. Belief proper is the negation of the negativity that affirms the eternal as the essential over and against the finite. The genuine contemporary, the believer, grasps immediate simultaneity of actualities as its occasion, for it is in this that the absolute life is seen. The third moment thus would seem to reach back to the immediate from out of interiority. The question of this kind of contemporaneity and its identification with the believer should be thought also in accordance with Kierkegaard's claims to lift Christianity towards an ideality beyond the sedative effects of Christendom. This ideality that desedates would be the event of the eternal Christ and the temporal individual in a relation of contemporaneity. Some rupture with the division, the wall, or it turns out the fence, between interiority and immediate contemporaneity, idea and simultaneous actuality. A lot of jargon there. Any hands? There should be some hands there. I would conjecture that the genuine contemporaneity is an address of or a relation of lives. It's not an idea, it's not an eyewitness account, it's some sort of an encounter or a relation. The advent of the life of the believer is the emergence of an address to an other like no other, that is both inside of us and outside of us and neither. It is, right? I throw that neither in, but it is a third stage since A, it incorporates the Socratic moment in its ideality. The life of the believer is not without the moment of interiority, and by extension the historical eyewitness, and yet B, it returns back to the immediate as the place where the properly Christian moment is occasioned. So the genuine contemporaneity is not excused from the realm of the immediate simultaneity of actualities, but in fact belongs there as to its original destiny. Thus, while we said that historical erudition on the life of Christ does not know how it is done, and since the Socratic likewise, it must be said, isn't quite sure how to make it happen, the third moment, the returning to immediate contemporaneity from the interiority of the second, as the site of a singular address to this other like no other is, we can say, doing it. The believer is practicing Christianity. Part 4, the spectacle, the fantasy, and the offense. Quote, you've heard it before. Thus, every human being is able to become contemporary only with the time in which he is living, and then with one more, with Christ's life upon earth. For Christ's life upon earth, the sacred history, stands alone by itself, outside history. We turn now to search out the parallel exposition of the proper relation to immediate contemporaneity in Kierkegaard's Practice and Christianity. The main difference between the two accounts, the one in Fragments and the other in Practice, is A, that Practice concentrates its account of Christ's contemporaneity on a reading of the passage, "Blessed is he who is not offended at me." And B, the substitution of the Socratic moment in Fragments for the moment of fantasy in Practice. Thus, by A, "Blessed is he who is not offended at me," each of the moments will be constructed around the possibility of being offended at the eternal life. We will see that the believer risks being offended, and that as such they are capable of receiving the blessing. Number 1, history. Quote, Christ's presence here on earth never becomes a thing of the past, end quote. That's great, right? Oh, great. Christ's life never becomes a thing of the past. How are we supposed to understand this? Just as in Fragments, in Practice and Christianity, Kierkegaard's first stage is about a historical witness. It is a critique of the historical erudition that seeks to justify the claims for the divinity of Christ via discursive strategies that take the life of Christ to be something ago, something in the past, at a distance from us. The historical demonstration concentrating as it does on the actuality of circumstance, relics, eyewitness accounts, themselves relics, for the sake of convincing us, does not grasp that about which it seeks to demonstrate the reality of. Quote, history makes Christ into something else than he is in truth. End quote. There is something in excess of the meaning of Christ for the historical scholar, which removes the truth of Christian practice from the sphere of the demonstrable. Of this truth, Kierkegaard writes, quote, never in all of eternity can history establish in all of eternity can history establish that. What is that? The truth of Christian practice. Quote, another quote following right on its heels. Thus, history indeed can richly communicate knowledge, but knowledge annihilates Jesus Christ. End quote. History, as knowledge, covers over the possibility of this genuine contemporaneity that is essential to the meaning of Christian practice. It eclipses or occludes the very thing it seeks to demonstrate, i.e. the ever-present eternal life. Quote, a historical Christianity is nonsense, he writes, because whatever true Christians there are in any generation, in any era, are contemporaries with Christ. So whenever you have true Christians, they're living in contemporaneity with Christ. Thus, it is not by the results of historical erudition that we will remain steadfast in the possibility of this ageless address. On the contrary, Kierkegaard suggests that the 1800 years for him have had for the most part a numbing and distancing effect. Okay, this is the climax of the entire paper, this quote. All the vitality and energy was distilled out of Christianity. The paradox was slackened. One becomes Christian without noticing. Everything becomes as simple as pulling on one's socks. That's great. It's great. End quote. Kierkegaard's dire diagnosis is that Christendom has abolished and banned Christianity due to the cultural transfixion upon the actual and the direct historical demonstration of the nature of what was once, long ago, 1800 years ago, actual. It makes Christianity simple, easy, palatable. It ameliorates the real tension and question that Christ's life represents. As we will see, it suppresses the possibility at taking offense at the sacred. 2. Interiority and phantasm. Quote, the point is that in Christendom, one has only a fantasy picture of Christ. End quote. Just as the demonstration, the historical, and the eyewitness can prevent the genuine relation to the paradox of this other contemporaneity, so too can the fantastic. In practice, instead of the Socratic moment, the second moment is fantasy, which, like historical erudition, but in a different way, cuts us off from this ageless but singular encounter. Quote, well, if one goes and lives intoxicated in fantasies, if one allows the fantasy to create a fantastic figure of Christ, to which one then relates at the distance of imagination, well, then one does not notice the offense. End quote. Kierkegaard implies that imagination can function to keep the offense, the danger of Christ's life at a distance. It distances the real challenge of Christ's exceptionality by providing us a masterable ideal that makes us cheerful in the face of the fortune of the world. Kierkegaard contends that we can imagine that we know Christ, that we can become convinced by the fantasies of his nature and claim on that basis to have a personal relation to him. But we avoid something thereby. We evade a possibility that is precisely the locus for the real instauration of Christianity. Quote, if one has only a fantastic picture of Christ, then it is quite possible not to be offended. But if one is not contemporary with Christ in this way, then it is also impossible to become Christian.
The one, end quote, the one who is content with his or her phantasmatic Christ does not live the possibility of the offense, since the phantasm is a construction in interiority of what one wants, needs. It is all too convenient. But the offense is only possible when one leaves the phantasmatic sphere of interiority behind and enters onto the place indicated above as a singular address to an other outside of history, outside of actuality. How does one even address oneself to something outside of actuality? Fantasy makes the ideal into the penultimate convenience. It is an image that contents us, keeps us happily where we are. When Kierkegaard writes that practice, this text, when he writes of the text, practice in Christianity, that it is the attempt to introduce Christianity into Christendom, right? And Christendom is the word to refer to society, Christian societies that Kierkegaard sees as inauthentic or something like this, right? So he conceives of his practice, he conceives of the project of practice in Christianity as introducing Christianity to Christendom. He means to suggest that our historical knowledge and our fantastic constructions are fundamentally evasions of an encounter that only those with the perhaps Abrahamic faith can venture. Okay, part 3, offense, and de-distancing. Quote, this life outside history, is too lofty for them to bear seeing it in daily use. It must be at a distance for them to be able to bear it, end quote. Yikes. In practice, in Christianity, the concept of offense functions as a possibility lived by those with a genuine relation to Christ's eternal presence. Kierkegaard's analysis of contemporaneity with Christ is organized by a reading of Luke 7:23 and Matthew 11:6. Blessed is he who is not offended at me. It is only for the believer in genuine contemporaneity with Christ that the possibility for taking offense arises. One aspect of the offense that Christ represents is twofold: lowliness and loftiness. We might be offended by a human claiming to be God. We might be offended at the loftiness of such an affirmation. And we might be offended by claims made upon us to respond to such a call. How would you respond to somebody who's asking you to go through him to get to the Father? Alternately, we could take offense at the lowly company he keeps. What is the God-man doing with the homeless, the mad, the prostitutes, those tax collectors? What contradiction! The loftiness of the affirmation and the lowliness of the company seem to violate from the beginning the possibility of belief, since it's so offensive. It makes it so easy not to believe. This ageless other, whose exceptional alterity is bound to this agelessness, is presented in his offensiveness not only as associated with the lowly and the lofty, but also as mad, as insubordinate. The madness of the contemporary, like no other, is the madness of a reckless compassion, quote, of unconditionally, recklessly concerning oneself with each sufferer. This alone would have been sufficient for him to come to grief in the world, end quote. There is a recklessness Kierkegaard associates with Christ that offends a common sensibility of what it is that one does with a life. This infinite compassion for each singular sufferer appears totally other than the compassion or considerations of the norm. I can't give everything I own to the poor and follow you. I have a child to take care of. I have debts to pay, projects to complete, ad nauseum. Quote, the compassion of sausage peddlers is trapped in one consideration for the other sausage peddlers, and then for the saloon keepers. Okay, so that's kind of a index to a particular time, but hopefully we can make sense of that. Their compassion is not totally reckless because they eye the prices of the other sausage peddlers in the name of their own self-interest, quote, and so it is with every condition of life. They would be the first to render it ludicrous if this reckless compassion made even a merely moderate appearance, end quote. The saloon keeper, the writer of the history of Spinoza's reception, would find the contemporaneity of Christ's life offensive because it undermines a fundamental assumption of the norm that holds sway, i.e., a careful circumspection regarding how best to advance our interests. This ageless other is not at one with this norm, and as such is offensive. Quote, you've heard it before, it's too lofty for them to bear seeing it. It must be at a distance for them to be able to bear it. In fantasy, in idea, is an object of historical erudition. Christendom, for Kierkegaard, is precisely what keeps Christ, this reckless and timeless life, at a distance. It will go to great extents to do so. It historicizes and fantasizes the life to push it away. And as such, it will never recognize that it does not itself know how to do it, how to practice Christianity. Quote, the reckless compassion, comes out of compassion for people, and it is people who trample it down, end quote. The reckless, lofty, and lowly compassion is offensive because it annuls the pull of the future of our own well-being. It cancels our debts to the future and recognizes a love that in its madness will only ever recognize itself in a present that, in a singularity beyond compare, addresses the suffering of each and every individual. But it is only the believers who can become offended by their ideal. It is only in the encounter of genuine contemporaneity with Christ that the believer can recognize in absolute destitution that they are not what they say they are, that they follow not what they worship. Perhaps it is only the believer who can recognize the contradiction within themselves and thus enter into the genuine struggle of faith. Part 5. Called The Blessing of Concluding. What does it mean to, do we have a time check? It's okay? Okay. It's just
we started late, remember?
Okay. So what does it mean to be a believer, to be a follower then for Kierkegaard? What then does it mean to have faith? If it is to mean being contemporary with Christ, what does such a contemporaneity look like? It is certainly a religiosity that is not guided by discourses of knowledge that either in the form of the eyewitness or the historian provide the truth. As we saw in the reading of fragments, the eyewitness is the occasion for the Socratic dialectical antithesis, and then the subsequent appropriative event of the paradox, which is the genuine contemporaneity. If there is no faith, there is no contemporaneity. If the religious is submerged within the discourse of knowledge and demonstration and control, quote, then in that case, in that instance, it is a long time since Christ lived. Can I read that again? Did that make sense? Can I read that again? If there is no faith, there is no contemporaneity. Okay, fine. If the religious is submerged within the discourse of knowledge, demonstration, mastery, quote, then in that instance, it is certainly a long time since Christ lived. The eternal life happened 1800 years ago. We suspend ourselves at a remove from this peculiar destiny of contemporaneity with the absolute by articulating the present as that in which Christ is not. Quote, but as long as there's a believer, this person, in order to have become that, must have been, and as a believer must be, just as contemporary with Christ's presence as his contemporaries were. End quote. How will we know a believer when we see one? The conclusion of this section intimates that we will know the believer by the fact that he or she has risked being offended at their ideal, have risked a relation to a reckless compassion. Okay, and this is a bizarre conclusion. If to enter into a zone of contemporaneity with the eternal life is to risk the offense, to risk being at odds or at variance with that which one claims to worship, And B, to have risked being offended is the condition of the believer. And if C, we recall that Kierkegaard's reflection on offense is built around a reading of the line, "Blessed is he who is not offended at me," then D, I think we can make the following conjectures. 1. The scholar of history, and this is like a summary and an attempt to push it a little bit. The scholar of history is not offended, since she constructs a knowledge of the eternal life that posits that exceptional life as an actuality that is in the past. Christ's exceptionality is something that happened 1800 years ago for Kierkegaard. Nor is the phantasmatic Christ offensive. It is a reflection of just what we need to sustain our interest in the other sausage peddlers and the quality of their work. It, too, the fantastic, has evaded the possibility of offense. 2. The scholarly Christ and the phantasmatic Christ are inoffensive in different ways, but are both fundamentally indefinite postponements of a destiny to encounter the life of Christ as eternal, as always imminent, as an ontologically determinate possibility of being. So it's like you have the phantasmatic and the historical as ways of covering over the radicality of Christ's life. But it seems like for Kierkegaard, to conceive of what it means to be alive is to necessarily think of the individual as possibly having a relation to this uncanny contemporary. 3. The eternal life is distinguished from the fantastic or Socratic interiority by the fact that the life is an address, a relationality between something in history and something outside of history, rather than an actual discrete entity, a fantasy, or an idea. So Christ is not an idea, not a fantasy. It's something that we enter into relationship with, and we can be as genuinely contemporary with Christ as his actual contemporaries were. 4. It is only those who enter into zones of contemporaneity with Christ that risk being offended and seeing themselves offended. They gamble recognizing that, in fact, they cannot live with their ideal. It is too much. That they cannot be in relation to that which they claim to worship, that which they claim to live in accordance with. The believer in the genuine practice of Christianity is a subjection to the possibility of seeing that they are offended by the very thing they believe is holy. 5. It is only those who risk being offended by their ideal, only those who enter into contemporaneity with one who is dead but never dies, that can be blessed, and thus can be said to be doing it, practicing Christianity. So it is in recognizing, cognizing one's fault, one's attachment to a non-Christian life, one's having made it too easy to be a Christian, like pulling on your socks, through fantasy and the tales of history, that the third moment, where one is in relation to an eternal but singular life, through the moment of blessing, happens. That was a tricky one. It amounts to risking seeing one's own hypocrisy, seeing the convenience one has made of Christianity in the moment of address to Christ. In this risking for Kierkegaard, we can think that there is a turning to face, a coming to a halt before the eternal singularity of a life that is reckless. For it is only there in the zone of a contemporaneity like no other that we can accept and Christ can give the blessing. Thank you very much, y'all. I appreciate your attendance. Attending.
Well, it's our practice here to have a formal respondent, commentator, and Dr. Ted DiMaria, the philosophy department, is going to take that role. Do you mind passing the mic over?
Oh, no, of course. I'll be happy to.
You're going to follow the Rosie example, Dr. DiMaria?
No. I'm going to sit comfortably. As soon as I figure this out. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So those of you who know me know that I don't say anything without qualifying it beforehand. So I need to qualify what I'm about to say before I start. First, I wanted to say that these comments are going to be focused on what Dr. Bohnet had to say about philosophical fragments and not the practice. In part because I ran out of space, and by the time I was done with this, I'd be talking too long. So, secondly, my aim here was to elucidate, using some other aspects of Kierkegaard's philosophy, some of the concepts that Dr. Bohnet was talking about in the context of his paper. Hopefully to illuminate a little bit some of the things that he was talking about, but I'm sure it's going to muddy it a little bit in some respects as well, because they don't quite match up entirely, I think. And then finally, at the end, I have a possible point of discussion, which I raise here, and I've received a request from a certain somebody to give an additional critique from the author of the critique. So I'm going to do that at the end, sort of extemporaneously. So, comments. Here are the prepared comments. Considered in its most basic structure, faith requires three fundamental components: a believer, the object or subject that constitutes the matter of the believer's faith, and the unique relation between the believer and the object of belief that distinguishes it as a faith relation, as opposed to another kind of relation, such as the relation between subject and object involved in knowledge claims. As described by Dr. Bohnet in his excellent exegesis, Kierkegaard devotes considerable energy to determining not only what distinguishes a faith relation from other types of relations, but in the process, he also describes what makes genuine Christian faith so challenging to achieve. Dr. Bohnet focuses his account of Kierkegaardian faith around the concept of contemporaneity, as Kierkegaard develops this notion in Philosophical Fragments and Practice in Christianity. The core question is how best to conceive of the relation of the believer of today to Christ in light of the fact that they exist in different historical periods, which seems to remove Jesus from being a contemporary with whom the believer can relate and places him in the category of a deceased ancient prophet. However, placing him in the category of deceased ancient prophets presents a notion of Christian faith that threatens to relate the believer not to the person of Christ, but only to the historical evidence of his existence and to the doctrines of his teachings. Yet it seems clear that in Kierkegaard's thought, faith concerns neither the cognitive confirmation of historical evidence nor an intellectual adherence to doctrines. Rather, faith involves a relation between subjects or persons. In the act of faith, the Christian believer makes a passionate commitment that establishes a personal relationship with Christ. It is precisely here that the focus of Dr. Bohnet's paper becomes so crucial, since to possess a faith of this kind raises the question of how the believer can be in a personal relationship, that is, how she can make a passionate commitment with someone who lives in a different historical period. Accordingly, in order to maintain his conception of faith as a relation between subjects, Kierkegaard must give an account that makes it possible and intelligible to conceive of the Christian believer and Christ as contemporaries. As Dr. Bohnet explained, Kierkegaard recognizes three senses of what it means to be a contemporary in Philosophical Fragments. But it is only the last of these senses that can support Kierkegaard's distinctive notion of faith described above, and the other two necessarily fall short. Consider first the eyewitness. The eyewitness is an observer of facts and can provide detailed descriptions of circumstances and events surrounding the life of a person. Yet while it is clearly possible to know various details of events surrounding Jesus' life through eyewitness accounts of the apostles and other documents from Jesus' historical contemporaries, one does not thereby understand how to make the kind of commitment that constitutes faith. This should not be surprising, since such accounts aim to provide, although they can only approximate, objective certainty about the person of Jesus and his life, but faith involves inward movements of the heart that are not subject to objective scrutiny. However, the inward character of faith suggests that Socratic interiority, which is the second meaning of Kierkegaardian faith described by Dr. Bohnet, offers more hope of capturing the true meaning of faith. Socratic interiority aims to diminish the significance of the immediately observed phenomena described by the eyewitness in favor of an appropriation of Christian truth. This appropriation entails an orientation of one's life around the truth of Christianity while recognizing the absence of any objective certainty about it. In concluding on scientific postscript, Kierkegaard uses the analogy of Socrates' orientation of his life around the truth of the immortality of the soul to illustrate this appropriation process. From Kierkegaard's perspective, the question of whether the soul is immortal can only yield objective uncertainty. That is, it is a question without an objectively certain answer, and yet Socrates appropriated immortality as his truth in the way in which he lived his life. For example, Socrates chose to allow the Athenians to execute him rather than commit a moral wrong against the state of Athens by escaping prison. And he made this choice because he regarded such a moral wrong as damaging to his immortal soul. In making this choice, Socrates did not enjoy the luxury of having objective knowledge of his soul's immortality. As a result, he demonstrated a passionate, that is a non-cognitive, commitment to the truth of his soul's immortality by placing its care above mortal concerns. In this manner, Socrates, and presumably the Christian believer in her relation to the truth of Christianity, attains a kind of relation to what is eternal by affirming with his or her heart what eludes the grasp of objective investigations. Yet, although adopting this stance of Socratic interiority connects the Christian believer with what is eternal, it does so, as becomes clear in Dr. Bonnet's account of Philosophical Fragments, only by negating the finite, objectively investigable world of the eyewitness, that is, by treating it as insignificant. In so doing, the Christian who stops at Socratic interiority becomes disconnected both from the complete expression of herself as having both finite and eternal aspects, and from the historical person of Jesus with whom she must relate in order to achieve the personal relationship necessary for faith. What is needed, therefore, is still a higher kind of truth that synthesizes and mediates the finite order of the immediate factual truths attainable through eyewitness accounts with the eternal truth attainable through Socratic interiority. The Christian believer must return again to the immediacy of the historical world observed by the eyewitness, and she must do so in order to relate not merely to Christianity as a doctrine, but to the person of Jesus himself. In returning to the immediacy of the historical world, the Christian believer does so this time with the understanding that the truths taught by the historical Jesus must be passionately appropriated through faith, and she does not make the assumption that the observable evidence of this world will alone establish the truth of Christianity. In returning, again, to the finite world, the Christian believer now connects to the person of Jesus, but this time Jesus is not merely a person from a bygone era who is investigated objectively, which is the way he was previously understood by the eyewitness. Rather, Jesus becomes a contemporary of the believer by virtue of the believer's appropriation of the truth of Christianity, irrespective of where the believer stands on the historical spectrum in relation to Jesus. Yet, it is in the true Christian's straddling of the distinct dimensions of the finite and the infinite, and of the realms of immediate and mediated truth, that we gain an indication of the arduous spiritual gymnastics Kierkegaard demands from someone who hopes to attain faith. Consider, for example, that the first movement towards the conception of Christ's contemporaneity, which is essential for faith, involves a repudiation of the default starting point of inquiries in the modern world, namely a trust in our ability to gain knowledge through objective measures like historical evidence, scientific investigations, and philosophical arguments. It requires the believer to embrace the truth of Christianity through a non-cognitive, affective affirmation that defies the believer's ability to convey this truth to others in a manner that will allow them to gain universal acceptance. But worst of all, In order to establish the contemporaneity with Christ that is necessary for faith, the believer must seemingly do the impossible. After managing somehow to free herself from the immediacy of the historical world, and finally reaching the state of Socratic interiority, she must return to the immediacy of the historical world from which she worked so hard to escape. She must embrace the very objective order that held her spirit enthralled, and which threatened to hold it permanently captive. She must learn to be in the objective order without being of it, or at least not to be of the objective order alone. None of this is an exercise of the novice in the world of spirit, and therein lies a fundamental criticism of the Kierkegaardian conception of the Christian faith. It is exclusive and reserved for the elite rather than being inclusive and for the many. It is here that we may legitimately wonder whether Jesus, the champion of the marginalized masses, meant to reserve his message for the extraordinary few who are capable of the arduous steps of contemporaneity described by Dr. Bohnet today, or whether he envisioned a saving faith that is realistically attainable by all. Whether the prophet of love thought of the ultimate love of faith as being attainable only by an elite few, even if it is technically open to all, or whether he envisioned this love as extending to as many who would receive it openly. Kierkegaard is certainly correct in thinking that faith requires choice, but his view of Christian faith as narrowly circumscribed for an elite few is not as obviously tenable. Okay, so that was the point for reflection or discussion. If anybody is interested in taking up that question of for whom is the Christian faith meant. So the additional extemporaneous thought that I was going to share is about the Kantian notion of faith, of time, rather. And so there's this guy called Kant. So the basic concern here would be this. If Kant is right, time would be a structure of the way in which we experience the world, right? And it's a structure which has a necessary structure itself. So that simultaneity means a specific something in the way in which humans have experience, right? Simultaneity and hence contemporaneity have to have a distinctive meaning within the way in which experience unfolds. If that's true, then what we can say about the Kierkegaardian notion of contemporaneity is that it is at best metaphorical, that there is no real experience of contemporaneity in the Kierkegaardian sense, because it would require a relation to something that A, exists outside of time, and that B, violates the very structure in which human beings, by the nature of the oh, don't do that. By the very nature of the structure of time as a formal intuition, that is, a form of intuition. So in other words, it could make sense as a metaphor, but it can't make sense as something that is actually possible to experience. And that would be the end of my comments. That was my mom, by the way. So
That excuses it.
that totally excuses it.
Can I just say one thing? I'm probably come back to it maybe. Just so you're saying that for Kant, contemporaneity would be simultaneity, right? Which is one of those. What is the principles? It's in there.
Yep.
And that our experience is going to be limited to sort of.
So it's limited to contemporaneity in
as simultaneous actualities.
Yes.
So this other contemporaneity that Kierkegaard is trying to delimit or articulate or poeticize or possibilize doesn't make sense within Kant's concept of experience.
Right.
Except So then you have in Kant, you say, well, we can't have an experience of eternity. We can't have an experience of eternity. But we have to assume things like freedom and maybe even in the immortality of the soul in order to have morality. And we know, I'm sorry, but I have a friend who did some work on Fichte. That guy knows him. But Fichte was really about, I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but uniting the practical philosophy and theoretical philosophy. And so the limits of possible experience that determine what we can know and what we can experience. So we can't have eternity there. But then we make this assumption of freedom or something for ethics. So if Fichte is trying to bring those things together, and if Kierkegaard's a student of Schelling, who's, I don't know, I'm just wondering whether or not we should read the contemporaneity of simultaneous actualities as the theoretical, and this other contemporaneity as this moral religious, and that in fact the theoretical and the practical in Kant, they're held radically apart. But that being held apart collapses with Fichte. So I'm wondering if Kierkegaard isn't trying to create an ontology of the subject that is not holding those two worlds apart. And that maybe we can understand, but then we can't talk about the contemporaneity with Christ as an experience. Like, can we still talk about it as an experience? Or, so I don't know. To me, that would be the gesture, is like how to unify the practical and the theoretical. And maybe that's what Kierkegaard's up to in the construction of an ontology. First thoughts, best thoughts sometimes.
Shall we have some questions?
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I enjoyed it. I'm just trying to understand Kierkegaard's thinking here a little bit more. So this is not my area. So it seems that Christians would say that Jesus, although he lived on earth, is still alive today. So why is, this is just a basic understanding sort of question for me about Kierkegaard. Why is he so concerned with us being contemporaneous with Christ and his life on earth? Why couldn't Kierkegaard say, well, we're not contemporaneous with Christ and his life on earth, but we're contemporaneous with Christ who is still alive today? And so that would be how we're able to have a personal relationship with Christ.
You mean the ascended Christ?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I was going to ask a similar question. Let me just throw a term here that I think someone who was coming to your talk not from philosophy, but from practicing Christianity would say,
Yeah.
Where's the resurrection, right? Isn't the resurrection a shattering of at least the standard ways of conceiving of temporal limitations? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
To me, I would read it and I'm just gesturing towards an answer, not that I know, but like my first thought would be that the resurrection is going to be part of, and yeah, maybe I'm out of my league here, but the resurrection is going to be part of what Christ's life on earth was. Yes?
It certainly is an event that takes place historically.
That is set.
After all, chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians makes very clear Paul sees the resurrection as central to understanding who the historical Christ is.
As an exception, as like having, in a sense, having no peer. Like to me, the reading of Christ as exceptional that I'm trying to, that the resurrection has to be factored in order to understand his exceptionality.
Right.
And so to me, it's that exception that is never not present. So I would ask a follow-up question and just like, I don't understand the problem there. Like to me, the Christ that is never not with us is precisely the Christ that, manifested in itself in a life. I don't know. I guess I would just want a little, could you clarify your question? Or?
So it's not, I guess what I'm asking is, why is Kierkegaard going for these really strange notion, this really odd way of thinking about being contemporaneous, when, on a Christian view, Jesus is alive now.
Yeah, but what does that mean? So the Christian view says Jesus is alive now. Well, I'm going shopping. I mean, to me, it's like Christ's contemporaneity is a gauntlet. It's a challenge that is a rupture in the norms by which most of us are living our lives. Like, to me, if Christ was beside you or with you, living, like, to me, and I tried to put it in my abstract, it's not as if Christ was living. Like, so we can do this. We can say, imagine Christ is right there. Are you still going to be talking about your haircut? You know what I mean? Like, are we still? What are we going to? How are we going to live if that life is there? So yeah, the Christian says that life is there, and Kierkegaard would say, yeah, Christendom is full of the assertions that Christ is always with me, right? But the point for Kierkegaard is like, yeah, that's great, but it's so easy to be hanging out, like to be contemporaneous with Christ. It's like pulling on one's socks. Like, to me, Kierkegaard is trying to say, if one was genuinely contemporary with Christ, you risk being offended by his actions that violate the norms of what one does with a life. And so to me, he's emphasizing contemporaneity as the site of a relatedness. How it's nice to talk about, he says the fantasy. Right, the fantasy of Christ. Yeah, Christ is always with me. He keeps me counsel, and however, he loves me and forgives me. But I think for Kierkegaard, there's something a little bit dangerous and reckless and mad and offensive about Christ that is unsettling. And I think that that's part of what he's trying to do is kind of deconstruct the Christianity that's become sedimented in his culture that he just sees as so errant from the spirit of that which they worship. So you could do the spirit in the letter. And you could just say Christendom is just following according to the letter of Christianity, the teachings or the sort of ideas about Christ. But the real Christian is something else, who's actually, I would say, is actually in relationship to eternity. So like Kant says, no, you can't have an experience of eternity. I don't think that that's Kierkegaard's position at all. I think that the Word or the Christ's life is always, it's never not now. The condition of there being a now is that there's also the ever more, the eternal. So I don't know. To me, it's just he's trying to make dwellers of Christendom a little bit anxious about whether or not they're truly following the radicality that got Christ killed. I don't think that answers precisely your question. It would take some time to think about it. But
if you were to follow that radicality that got Christ killed, it would kill you instantly.
Indeed.
Instantly. So there's...
Relatively. You might take some time.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
It would overwhelm beyond imagination.
Yeah. And so blessed be, or what? Or so we shouldn't do it? I guess
I'm not ready to die yet.
Well, on the one hand, it would be...
I have to be in Christendom so I can live. Sorry, I'm not...
No, that's a great point. I think that one way to respond would be to say, well, there's a certain cultural indifference to, like the time of Christ, religion was very central to the power of the community, and you had somebody who's being heretical. That's a public enemy. To me, it might be that because of our cultural indifference to certain religious truth and its connection with state power, you might be able to make it a little bit longer than right away. But maybe not for long, though.
So I think the culture could tolerate me for a while.
Right.
But I couldn't tolerate me for any time.
Really? What do you mean? Say more. I want you to say more.
It's like the juxtaposition. If you were able to reach that moment,
right,
would, by its tension of sinfulness, be unexplainable.
Yes.
I'm not.
But I think that for Kierkegaard, that would be the embarking on the genuine struggle, and that would also be, maybe in an Augustinian move, the onset of a genuine Christian community,
right? That if you could have friends in contemporaneity with Christ, like to me, that's what Augustine was like trying to instantiate. I don't know. I think it would be impossible to carry out, but I think that there are certain thinkers who don't think there's anything else worth doing but the impossible, and that Christ, for some reason, Christ was able to, I guess he was, I don't know, was Christ impossible?
Yeah, I can take that.
That's great, yeah, thank you. Can I go first?
Okay, this is sort of related to recklessness and activity for the elite. I think this is related in like a few different terms of the elite and the inaccessible, but like spiritual gymnastics is one of them. I really like that phrase. Then I think also it's one thing to put yourself in this risk, but can you be this reckless when other people are depending on you? So your example was even like, I have a kid, is it like worthwhile to put them through this really like risky, turbulent scenario? And then if this is so challenging to do, I don't know, it's almost like you might not see its worthwhileness until you get to the end of it, right? So I guess just anyone who's just in Christendom but not a contemporary, why would they, if it is as easy as putting on socks, why would they want to change that, I guess? So.
Exactly. Why would they? I mean, it's so easy, and it's like, to me, that's part of what motivates Kierkegaard's writing, is this sort of fury that it's just like it's like a good TV show or something. It just complements your actuality. Like, I have this life, I buy cars, I do these things that support terrorism indirectly by buying certain products. Hey, I go to church on Sunday, we got the loudspeakers going. I mean, to me, it's like Christianity in Kierkegaard's eyes seems to be such a sham. Why have it? Why have it? Why not just, why even cling to it? If we're not going to honor his life and the radicality that it was, why even bother? I mean, to me, that's the challenge that Kierkegaard, I think, is trying to let himself echo. I think he thinks he's letting Christ's challenge echo. And so it's almost like perhaps the way to be genuinely contemporary with Christ is to let his voice, his address, echo amongst our actual contemporaries. I don't know. Question?
Do you read Kierkegaard then as only a splitter, someone who wants to, you can't be contemporary with Christ in Christendom or in the modern church, so you need to focus entirely on this very personal model? Or do you see that he's maybe asking these questions as an attempt at reform, at fixing Christendom so that Christendom is contemporary? Do you think that for Kierkegaard, you can't ever really have contemporary Christ-like community? Do you think it has to be?
That's so great, yeah. So when he says he's trying to introduce Christianity into Christendom, so there's the reformist movement, right? He's not, but he's also, I would say, trying to rupture. Like, you need to break free of Christendom if you're going to have this authentic encounter. Because it's kind of become like a habituality or a kind of a prison. It's almost like a box. It becomes part of the box. And so there has to be a rupture. There has to be some event that is separatist, right? It's like the Quebecois, we're going to separate from Canada or something like this. Like it's done, right? You have to have done with the mechanisms of complacency in order to be a genuine Christian, I think, for Kierkegaard. But then it's a double, so probably the best answer is double articulation. That you have to articulate it as a rupture with Christendom, but in doing so you have to also understand it as you're not going some other place. You're deconstructing the Christendom in Christendom, and you're altering its fabric. You're making a difference as a community.
And so when you have the Socratic interiority as the second moment, that is followed by a return to immediate actuality, there are your fellows, there are us. And to me, the challenge is to be a Christian in a genuine way, not in the solitude of your own home, but like in your daily life. That's where the real impossibility, perhaps, comes into question. I wake up, my cats are like, meow, meow, feed me, feed me. It's like I can't have a moment of mental space without this demand being put on me from the other. And I feel like, how Christian am I, right? I'm just this horrible machine of frustration. So to me, it's like the place of everyday life is not something separate from the genuine Christian. I don't know, it's a good question. But I think the double articulation is the best answer. Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm worried this might be more of a theological question than a philosophical one. But to whatever extent we can read Kierkegaard as Lutheran, and maybe we can't, it seems like both Lutherans and Catholics have this conception of the real presence in communion, right? And so there's this sense that Christ is physically present right now when this is happening, and possibly other times when it's sitting in the little box. So if that's the case, I wonder if that might give us like some way out of the sort of elitism problem. Because when I think about like the little old grandmother in the communion line, like, is she like sublating like the historical and all this?
Well,
maybe not, but like she is like,
You just
but
don't
she
know
has
it.
this sense that she's maybe, I don't know, right? But like, is that a solution? Because it seems like that's a place where there is this conception of a physically present contemporaneity. So I don't know.
yeah, the physically present contemporaneity, I'm not really sure what to do with, because it doesn't seem like Kierkegaard's this other like no other who addresses me from some eternal locus is anything that we would want to categorize as physical. Because to me that seems, but I wanted to say about the elitist, because I was thinking about this, not in relation to this question of the elite, but like, where do you learn about religion, right? You're brought up and people tell you 2,000 years ago this happened. So we're introduced to religion, perhaps, just if you give me it, right? Historically, we're told about this life and we're told its meaning. And then what happens? We have the Socratic moment where we internalize what we've learned about Christ's life, but we find a meaning for it for ourselves. So that would be moving from, the historical lesson as a kid, adolescent, you find this meaning, I'm just making this up, you find this meaning Socratically for yourself, and then there's this moment where you go beyond just having your idea and you engage in practice. To me, that the point to remember is that practice is the third moment. Practice is the believer. Practice is the genuine contemporary. So to me, it makes a certain sense. It's not elite at all. It's actually a very general process. We learn about religion or whatever religion it is from other people telling us about it, from these eyewitness people. We then make sense of it for ourselves. But then perhaps we realize that that's not enough, and we're driven by love to take action, to be that recklessly compassionate individual who, however that manifests for anyone. So to me, I don't think it has to be this little old grandmother is like doing Hegelian dialectics in her mind. No, but she has appropriated the meaning of this historical institutionalized life. And if she is a believer in Kierkegaard's precise sense, then she's taking, it's not just an interiority. It's not just an inner experience. The best way I think that my paper said is that it's really not either. It's not outside or inside. It's nowhere where there would be something else opposed to it. It's the moment.
It might be helpful to remember that we might call it the tension between wise and simple. It's something that I would say even obsesses Kierkegaard as a sub-theme in the concluding unscientific postscript. But I think he's sufficiently aware of the problem for Christian charity of saying that vast numbers of people are beneath his understanding of Christianity. He realizes that there would be a real spiritual danger in making an assertion like that. And maybe another place to think about this in relation to is his book Works of Love, which is very clear about how this point that you're making about the Christian life is lived out in relation with other people. But it's lived out in a way, just as Kierkegaard is arguing for a transformation of Christendom, he's also arguing for a transformation of our essentially pagan loves. That's the theme of Works of Love, is that our loves are, in the way that you described, the sausage peddler, right?
Yeah.
Our loves are loves of self-interest, which is how he reads pagan eros.
Right.
And even Aristotelian friendship is a kind of self-interest, although that was a little more complex.
Right.
But he wants to say that the claim of Christian charity is that it should transform all of our loves. Not that, I mean, you could read the claim of Christian charity as demanding us to sever all relationships, which in fact is at least one way of understanding the monastic impulse. You sever relationships and you do something new. Kierkegaard wants to say, no, what happens is all of those relationships get transformed, or they're not genuinely charity. And so there is a place for, I think, to come back, Dr. DiMaria, to your challenge, I think Kierkegaard is worried about the little old lady in the communion line or the pew or wherever, right? He's thinking about there has to be a way of understanding Christianity where it need not be intellectualized in order to be genuine. Although I think he would also say for a person like him, it can't but be intellectualized. There's no way to avoid that because of the demand of interiority and reflectiveness and the Socratic move.
There's a passage, or there's a sequence of passages where in Practice in Christianity, he's criticizing one of the local preachers or pastors of a church. And he's saying that this person who has, I think he refers to them as a flock, right? This person has a flock of people who come to this church regularly. And Kierkegaard's kind of upset because this preacher doesn't realize how he fails to live up to the rigors of Christianity. It's like, I don't know, it makes me anxious to think that holding Christianity up as an ideal that one has to strive for, that it's difficult to be a Christian, like, to me that doesn't seem like it has to be construed as elitism. Like, I think that he wants because it's agonistic, it's not intellectual, it's agonistic. He wants the preacher to recognize, as I tried to make the point in The Believer, of his own hypocrisy. And it's only through recognizing that one's not living up to the life that was laid down for us that genuine contemporaneity is possible. So it's almost like the preacher does injustice to that of which he speaks or she speaks by not recognizing in themselves fault. That they're presenting a Christianity to the people. It's like the politicians. The politicians feel like they have to dumb it down for the American citizens. That does us a lot of good, doesn't it? And it's like, for Kierkegaard's assessment is that the preachers are dumbing it down for the people, but that you don't need to. To me, it's like and it's not about intellectualizing it as much as revealing the struggle that goes on within. That in some way that struggle to attain this ideal is infectious, I think, for Kierkegaard, or there's like some element of contagion, and like hiding it behind this nice coherent vision of Christian piety is not going to inspire the life. So, I don't know. Yeah.
That's why I say this concept of the offense as being the most compelling part of this.
Mm-hmm.
To take offense at such a thing, it seems very Socratic to me.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like his conception of
The Socratic.
Socratic
Sure.
at all. It seems like the Platonic project itself, to get people to engage in this practice such that they find the eternal, yes, but they're finding it together. It's not an isolated something you do by yourself.
Right.
Socrates was never by himself, rarely, right?
Right, right.
As he was off, right, staring off in his own
Right, right.
The spirit, the daimon speaking to him. So that's not Socrates to me.
Right.
I mean, that's the idealized Socrates. And the Platonic project seems very similar. Like, unless you're taking offense, then you're not moving, right?
Right.
So.
If Socrates isn't disoriented, then you're not recollecting the eternal, or yeah.
I'm not sure. Can you? So, what you're taking issue with is, you think Kierkegaard is misconstruing the figure of Socrates?
He's just isolating an event. I get it, like a Socratic moment or something, but that's not Socrates to me. Is an internalized. The interiority is just a brief moment of the Socratic movement, I think, as experienced in the dialogues. So, yeah, but I think the end result of Kierkegaard's believer, the taking offense, like that seems very Socratic to me. That's all. It seems that's what makes it compelling to me.
Yeah, it seems like part of. There's one passage that I didn't include where he says that Christendom is basically pagan because it's just motivated by self-interest. Mm-hmm. And so he seems to suggest that, so when he's talking about Socrates, he's obviously trying to position it as that which Christianity overcomes, or, it's like, there's this pagan world, but, they don't really understand how to make the eternal happen in the real world because they're caught in this dialectic. Whereas,
that Socrates is central for Kierkegaard as the proto-Christian, because
as the proto, okay.
Yeah, he thinks that the Socratic spirit is. He spent a lot of time writing about Socrates. Socrates was his first book on Socratic irony, and he thinks of there's a kind of in the stage account of religion that he has. Socratic religiousness is just short of Christianity. So it's not, he wouldn't collapse paganism and Socratic at all.
But it seems like it's a tempting read because he does in practice, he does sort of, there's the historical, then there's the Socratic, which is interiority, but then to get to where the life of Christianity is, you have to go beyond to, an encounter with some otherness. Like, it seems like he wants to position Socrates in a, I hear you with the proto-Christian, but not quite Christian.
Sure.
Yeah.
Could we return maybe to Rick's question, because I think this is a central question that I can't, ever since you've asked this question, I can't get it out of my head, which is, why is it the case? Granted that contemporaneity is an essential component of the relationship involved in faith. Why is it insufficient that the contemporaneity of Christ is the risen Christ? Why is that? Why do we have to go back to the historical Christ?
Who's going back to the historical Christ? The historian? I don't get it.
Well, I thought that this was yeah.
He says you have Christ's life on earth, right? You've got to be contemporaneous with Christ in his life on earth. So that's Kierkegaard's going back to Christ.
But Christ's life on earth is not now. So to me, that's my problem. He's not Kierkegaard's not going to study what happened 1800 years ago. He's saying you can go back you can be contemporary with Christ when he was actually alive and be totally awry from the message.
But Christ the person, right? Christ the person is not. You can say that Christ's life is.
What makes Christ Christ is not ever not present. To me, that's the only way we can work with Kierkegaard. Does that not make sense? What makes Christ Christ is always present.
That's what I meant by the resurrection. That's the reality of the resurrection.
Okay.
But you pointed out, I think rightly, that Kierkegaard wants to argue that the resurrection is we can fossilize the resurrection and think of the resurrection as an event that occurred in 33 AD. And in fact, if we're thinking about, so what about Kierkegaard and apologetics, for example, you can imagine that's a way to fossilize Christ is to engage in rational argumentation regarding the historicity of the resurrection. But his argument, I'm not ready to say Kierkegaard would be completely uninterested in that project, but he would say there's a real danger in that project that you fossilize Christ by consigning him. There was a quote that you gave in your blurb for me that you didn't use, which is that quote about locking him in the tomb. Right. So that's a way of I think that's a lens into what Kierkegaard's trying to do is, what is a Christianity that doesn't lock Christ into the tomb? In other words, you can imagine a Christianity that acknowledges the reality of the resurrection, but still sees Christ as an object that is distinct from the believer. And that's what Kierkegaard's trying to combat, I think, and you're right, to combat it in a radical way, because he sees that as a way of taming or taming Christ or making Christ fantastical.
And you could say, like, well, what does the resurrection show? Well, it shows that his life is never ending. His body can die, but what makes Jesus Jesus is not something that can die.
But is that okay? So again, is this something that is the danger here? I think is that it's going to, what you just suggested, is going to border on the metaphorical again. That yes, the life of Christ continues metaphorically in that his teachings are still a relevant part of the contemporary world.
But that's not what he's saying.
But clearly that's not what he's saying, right? Yeah. So we need a relation to Christ.
You would not be a friend of
Christ the
modern,
person.
Liberal theologians who say the meaning of the resurrection is the warm fuzzy we have in thinking about Jesus. That's not what it means at all.
Right. Right.
But then and what you said Ted, about the Socratic movement at the end of the Phaedo, like, I don't know if Socrates believed in the immortality of the soul, but that's what he told his followers, right? So such that they would engage in the same practices that he is engaging in. It's sort of passing on the torch in that sense. And it seems like Kierkegaard means something wholly other, or a different experience than that, which, yeah, I'm having trouble figuring out what that is, and it's not metaphor.
Part of what's kind of worrying me along the same lines, I think, is this idea of this separate sacred history, right? Because it seems like the whole goal should be that we're kind of like, that the incarnation kind of brings these things together, right? And I kind of think,
I'm sorry, the goal, what the goal should be?
But it seems to me that the idea of the incarnation is a sort of bringing together of sacred and profane history. And so I'm thinking about this quote at the top here. So Christ's life on earth, the sacred history stands alone outside history. And I feel like that's part of the problem we're wrestling with here, because like at what point do you determine that something is then part of the sacred history outside of history, right? So like if the...
it's not my choice, right? Like.
What?
Okay, go ahead.
No, I mean...
It's not a matter of choice, is it?
No, I mean, I'm asking like, what does that actually entail? So like if the apostles are having a conversation about Jesus and he's not there, is that sacred history and it's not part of regular history? If Jesus is like distributing loaves and fish, is that like sacred history or real? Like,
what is a history beyond history would have to be, or what I think it's better to say, what is a life that's outside of history? Would just be an immortal life. The mortal life is our history, right? We exist in history as actualities, and our bodies die, and that sort of
That's, to me, generation after generation after generation. We could calculate how many generations in remove we are from that life, but the sacred history is, it's a peculiar turn of phrase that he uses, but I think that he's just trying to say that, yeah, there's a life that isn't becoming, that isn't actual, that isn't like a phone or anything you can point to, but it's never not present. Like it's, and I think that he wants to say that, and I try to make this as part of the ontological argument about the subject, like what is the ontological situation of a Christian individual? Well, sorry, it doesn't fit into certain conceptions of certain conceptions of time, but it seems like there's an eternal life or eternal presence, however we want to think about it, that is immanent in the constitution of any actual human being.
So the historical Jesus is no more part of sacred history than any other Christian?
I don't know if you could find that answer with Kierkegaard.
Okay.
I think you hinted at it when you talked about that Kierkegaard's view is synthetic. So I mean, John, your point about the incarnation, I think, is exactly right here. The Kierkegaard, the image that strikes me is in Fear and Trembling, and I can't remember, I think one of you alluded to this idea of the dance in Fear and Trembling where he talks about the infinitizing. You did, actually, Ted. Yeah, that's what it was. The infinitizing move is moving away from the concrete and finite, but that's not what Kierkegaard wants. He doesn't want the ascent in a way that's kind of, at least, well, if Dr. Lane were here, she would say that's a misunderstanding of Platonism, but there's an understanding that to ascend to the infinite is to leave the finite behind. And Kierkegaard explicitly rejects that because this dancer that he uses as a metaphor in Fear and Trembling makes the moves of the infinite, he says, and then manages to land, we might say to stick it, right, is what the Olympics commentators always say. And he contrasts that to the Knight of Infinite Resignation, who makes the infinite move and then kind of awkwardly collapses back to the ground. In other words, never fits in the concrete, in the finite. So we always recognize a crazy philosopher because crazy philosophers don't fit into the finite, right? Your examples of the crazy philosopher doesn't even notice the screeching cats that are hungry and want to be fed.
Right.
The crazy philosopher is off, like you were saying, Socrates staring off into space on the way to the house to have the party, the symposium, right? But that's not what the Knight of Faith is. The Knight of Faith is the person who makes the infinite move and then lands and looks like a sausage peddler, right? To where we look and say, I can't tell the difference. Is that guy a sausage peddler? And the answer is, maybe. We don't know. We can't tell.
So I guess, Joan, to come back to your question, like, so you're saying that how do we so you're saying that Christ's, the historical life of Christ, that body, right? How does one distinguish that from the sacred life that stands outside of history? Is that a paraphrase?
Yeah, or I don't know if I do want to distinguish that, but yeah. So how do we decide what belongs to sacred history?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
One thing, since we're a small group, I've let us go way over time and we started a little bit late, but if anyone needs to, if you've got things that you need to do, please feel free. But I want to sort of formally thank our speaker and responder. And it sounds like some are willing to stick around and talk some more. You have questions?
I actually just saw the flyer and I'm here on the limb. I've never read Kierkegaard. I've always been interested in theology, so that's
awesome.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
All the stuff that you're talking about, the contemporaneity, whatever that word is,
Mm-hmm.
the fact of Jesus always being with us and yet not being here, it just sounds so oddly like Jesus' conception of the kingdom of God. That he speaks about, that's one of the main themes throughout all the Gospels. The one thing that he talks about the most is this concept of the kingdom of God, which is something that's both, it's invisible, it's here, and also, even more importantly, its fulfillment and its actual reality is in the future. And it seems so much more, I don't, and that might be his connection to the sacred history part of it too, that there's this God through the Holy Spirit is working throughout history, saving souls, doing miracles, all these sort of things that you expect to be the things that are sacred, making relics sacred, that sort of stuff. So I feel, I don't know why, but in that seems to make a connection, at least to me, about what Kierkegaard is trying to point to. He's trying to point to this kingdom that Christ was pointing to. And I'm just...
That helps me.
And also kind of point further, kind of, does Kierkegaard ever talk about the kingdom? Does he ever make mention to it? Because that seems far more relatable to a contemporary, a pure essence of contemporaryism than being offended, that blessed is he who's not offended by me.
Right.
That's just something that pops to mind. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, I cannot speak for Kierkegaard's corpus for sure.
Sure.
Maybe in 30 years. Or if that, right? If that. But I like that because it's like one thing that the first part of your question made me think of is like, what did Christ think he was? Did Christ think he was when he says, I am the truth, the light, and the way? Does he think he's like some matter? Does Christ think of himself as historical Jesus? I think that no, he's probably, but is he being metaphorical? No, he's being literal, like it's a spiritual truth.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like he's trying to not fall from that. He's trying to speak from a place of spiritual truth. Mm-hmm. And to me, that place of spiritual truth, and maybe this is heretical, but it's like that place of spiritual truth is ever present. I can't escape it, but I escape it by fantasizing Christ. I escape it by just absorbing myself in chatter and a banal existence and not sacrificing to attend to it. And so to me, maybe that kind of gestures a little bit towards it, is that I would probably think, and just to reiterate, this problem of the historical versus the sacred, it seems not to have been a problem for him.
No.
And it seems like it could be a problem for theologians or scholars, academics but I don't think it was a problem for him. Just like it's not a problem for Buddha whether or not it's this robe or that robe.
Yeah.